Well, good morning, everybody. How's everything going today? Enjoyed the keynotes? Yeah?
Good.
We've been asked that if you're here, move towards the middle of the rows if you could, to let everybody in. Yesterday, we had a bunch of folks that ended up standing along the back wall, so we want to make sure everybody who comes in a little bit late, maybe after we got started, has a chance to sit down. But other than that, I think we're going to get started because we have a fairly tight window for all of this. So, introductions. My name is Mike Andren. This is David Babbitt. We're both product managers at Ping Identity. And we're here to talk to you about open business APIs today. So APIs for a while now have been a driving force of innovation across industries. And the most valuable of them are exposing data. Usually data owned, or hopefully owned, by entities other than those companies themselves. So today we're going to be talking about how identity and access management enables this open business movement to keep that data secure, ensuring that you're in compliance with all the regulations and laws that may apply to your industry, and making sure your customers' data that they've consented to what you're doing with it. Before we get into the details, though, I would like to introduce you to Chris. Chris has a wife and 2 kids. He's 47 years old. He lives in Napa, but works for a San Francisco startup. He's almost always on his phone. He's always connected. He's also a very outdoorsy guy. He also happens to be a little injury prone. He didn't like to talk about that. Because of that, he has a certain medical facility that he has frequented in the Napa Valley. Well, today Chris is on a business trip to Austin. And unfortunately, while walking to the lake in downtown Austin, where he was going to take a jog, Chris was struck by a pedicab. For those of you who don't know, a pedicab is this weird, freakish combination of a bicycle and a golf cart that silently hunts the streets of downtown Austin.
Driven by hipsters.
Generally driven by hipsters. So you know, watch out for them. Anyway, so poor Chris has been struck by this pedicab. And while he's awake and aware, it is obvious that he is fairly injured. His arm is broken. So an ambulance is called, Chris is picked up, and he's taken to a nearby hospital. Now, this nearby hospital is going to need access to Chris's medical records. Now, I see a couple looks of concern in the room, so I do want to let you know that while Chris is a very real person, this scenario is completely made up.
Thank you.
Chris is fine.
Thank you.
Okay? I also lied. Chris is here, so he's not in Austin today. Just put your worries aside there. Now, the doctors need access to Chris's medical records because, as I may have mentioned, he's injury prone. And this is not the first time he's broken this arm. In fact, he's had pins put into this arm. And now that he's broken it a second time, the doctors are very concerned that the pins are out of place and that they need to be put back where they're supposed to be. So they do need access to his previous x-rays, the doctor's notes, right, really the records from the last time he did this, which coincidentally, though certain Canadian songmistress might have said ironically, that first break was also when he was struck by a pedicab on a trip to Thailand. So the hospital in Austin needs to get his records from the healthcare group in Napa, where Chris was previously seen and treated for these other injuries. For that, they're going to need to exchange some data. So that kind of brings us to what is open business. So open APIs enable access. A lot of businesses have APIs. You've got all kinds of APIs. A lot of them are internally used so that data can transfer within a company. Operationally, your products have them, and your partners generally are accessing APIs. What we're talking about today is another kind, and these are the open, generally web-based APIs that are allowing third parties to gain access either to some form of process or data that's held within your enterprise. Now, we're calling this open business. But an important thing to note is this is not limited by geography or any particular industry. While we're going to be talking about healthcare today, these APIs are exchanging data really across the world and across every business. So in media and publishing, you have content syndication going on via API. So this is moving various bits of content, news stories, advertisements, across the different platforms, all in the background through the APIs. Manufacturing and supply chain is using APIs. Just-in-time manufacturing is highly reliant on knowing where things are, when things are coming. If there's any hiccup in that entire flow, it can have disastrous results downstream. APIs make sure that that communication is happening very quickly. Banking. Some of you in this room may have heard the term open banking. Yes? Yes? Okay, good. I figured that that may have come up amongst this group once or twice. It's kind of why we consciously decided not to tell you another open banking story. You may have heard that one. Healthcare. Healthcare is another similar to banking in which the customer's information is very much dear to them. It needs to be controlled. They need to have consent over it. But access to that data, being able to share it amongst the providers, amongst the various people involved in paying for healthcare, especially in this country. There are lots of parties involved in paying for healthcare in this country. And they all need access to this data to some degree to facilitate all of that. Well, they claim they do. So this is happening today. Oh, that one's just playing on its own. This is exciting. You will see in many different enterprises, in many different industries, you will see these developer portals starting to stand up, where they're providing ways for third parties to gain access to the data and/or processes that the company can do. And they're bringing they're putting these things out there, hoping, in many cases, that third parties will make use of these APIs to provide additional services to their customers that perhaps the main enterprise isn't providing. Now, one way to attract developers to your APIs, well, A, is to make them easy to use and really document them excellently. But another is to embrace standardization as much as makes sense for your particular industry. Now, in some cases, standardization has been regulated. You are being told very specifically, here are the APIs that you will provide, and here's what they look like. That makes it very easy for developers to interact with your APIs. But that's actually rare. Again, open banking comes up a lot, and we talk about it a lot. But in these other industries, there's not necessarily the same level of regulation, the same rules being applied. So the APIs that gain access to the data vary between the entities. But the thing that doesn't have to vary is the security that's wrapped around that. How do you make sure that the right third parties are gaining access to those APIs, only the ones that should? How do you make sure that the user has consented to having their data accessed by these third parties? And if that consent ever changes, how do you make sure that the next time that third party asks for the data, they don't get access to it? So the most widespread and most adopted way of securing your APIs and making sure that you're identifying all of the players involved is with OAuth and OIDC. Now, open banking itself, now I will talk about it, embrace this. And it is working right now. Today, this is happening across Europe. These security flows are being used to protect the financial data of the users who have put that data into the banks. This is how they've secured those APIs. The APIs that, yes, they were forced to make available, but this was the way that they selected to protect them. And because of, if you're protecting your financial data with this, this seems like a pretty good way to protect data that's maybe less secure, or in the case of healthcare, that you care even more about. So let's get back to Chris. So how does this, what I just talked about with open business, how does this apply right now to Chris in his current situation with his fake pain? Because remember, he's not really hurt. So just to bring you up to speed, he's there. The surgeon needs access to find out where these pins were so he can put his arm back together in the way that it was. And so the hospital in Austin needs to access records that are stored by the Napa Healthcare Group. So David's going to walk us through really the technical side of what that looks like for these two entities to interact, all with Chris's permission.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Very good. All right, so we're going to look at this mostly from the perspective of how Napa provides this service for Austin to access Chris's medical records. And so think of this list here as sort of the requirements from Napa's perspective, the things that they have to consider in order to securely provide access to the records. So obviously securing access to the APIs themselves. They need to consider all the regulation that they're covered by, so HIPAA in this case. They need to consider Chris's own authorizations, and so maybe in your use case, you've got different privacy controls that you're trying to extend to your users, and it might be consent. They have to consider strong authentication, making sure that somebody didn't pick up Chris's Post-it with his password on it and walk away with it, and now they're accessing the APIs as him. And then potentially some sort of delegation. Obviously, in this case, we're delegating to Austin to access Chris's medical records, but you might, in your world, have user-to-user sort of delegations or something like that. And there we go. All right, so I'm going to walk you through kind of at a technical level what this looks like. And so I'll mention a couple of things up front. One, so this is a little bit contrived in the sense that we're talking about this in terms of healthcare. In the United States, when you do a HIPAA release, you're pretty much signing away all rights for your medical group to give away your healthcare records for whatever purpose. So we're gonna do this as at a more fine-grained level, where Chris is able to say specifically what he wants Austin to see. But I'll say while it's a little bit contrived inside of healthcare in this use case, this is 100% modeled after what open banking looks like, where we've got specific authorizations by Chris for what a third party is able to access. That's kind of the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider as we're going through this, spoiler alert, this is pretty much an OIDC and OAuth workflow delivered primarily by all of your IAM components or capabilities inside of your existing tools. So there's not a whole lot of magic going on here. I don't know that you'll necessarily learn anything technically new, but as I'm going through this, just think about like what components you have in your infrastructure, if you're able to deliver on these use cases, or potentially where you might want to get like a capability uplift, all right? So first things first, again, kind of a little bit contrived. Doctor's going to take the iPad. They're going to go in there. They're going to look for Chris's healthcare provider, Napa. In the drop-down box, they find it. They click on that, and then now they hand the iPad over to Chris so that he can type in his password. So what's already happened under the covers, especially if you look at how this works in open banking, is that there's a dynamic client registration going on between Austin and Napa. So this isn't a case where a developer's going off and signing up for every single healthcare provider in the country for an OAuth client credential. It's not that. Instead, he registers, it's some sort of central authority, and then it's automatic how Austin registers with Napa in this use case. And hopefully it's using a standard like OAuth dynamic client registration. So Chris types in his password, potentially that's a validation against a directory server. Maybe it's federated, maybe he's logging in with a Google credential or a Facebook credential or something like that. So we do that check, so that's very typical. Next thing here is some sort of strong customer authentication, multi-factor authentication. So I think the thing to consider here is that it's always that balance between like adding additional friction and security to this workflow versus trying to make it a good experience for Chris, right? And so you want to have a lot of flexibility in the policies. Maybe it's because of where Chris is that we're going to apply a second factor of authentication. Maybe it's because it's been a while since he's typed in his password. It's been a while since he's done a sort of a fingerprint, right? So that's one thing to consider, is how much flexibility and control do you want over the policies that dictate when to do a second factor of authentication. And the next thing to consider is what does that actual experience look like for Chris. So ideally it's something like a notification to his mobile app. He sees the notification, he clicks on it, it takes a picture of his face, whatever, he sticks his thumb on the phone, that kind of thing. Less than ideal would be some sort of one-time password going to his email account. He has to look it up and then type it into the iPad or whatever. So kind of consider what that user experience looks like as well from Chris's perspective. So the next step in this workflow, after we've authenticated Chris, it's actually him, not somebody that stole the post-it, and this is a little bit outside the scope of OAuth, pun intended. So what we're doing here is we're capturing a fine-grained authorization. So in the case of, usually inside of OAuth, you're just saying I'm granting Austin the ability to access my medical records, period. In the case of open banking, it's really fine-grained. So in that case, it's, this third party is able to access these specific resources, in banking transaction history, time frame, which bank accounts. So in the case of like a medical use case, maybe it's something like, Chris knows that he needs to talk about the screw in his arm or whatever, but maybe he doesn't want to reveal the fact that he's got a screw loose up here. And so he's going to pick the specific medical history that he wants to share with Austin. So he goes through and he chooses some previous encounters or his x-rays specifically or whatever. That needs to get stored somewhere. And so in our case, we're going to store that in the directory server. You could store it in a database, whatever. You need to store his specific authorizations. Okay, so at this point in time, we're going to return the code back to Austin. Code gets exchanged for an ID token, access token. ID token claims about who Chris is. That's what enables Austin to store a record inside of their database for Chris. The access token is what they're going to use to access all the APIs and get access to Chris's medical records. So one thing to consider here as well is going back to that fine-grained authorization. It's potentially a scope. It's just an attribute inside of the access token that says what Austin's going to be able to see about Chris. But it could be a dynamic scope in the sense that we have to identify that consent record somehow, that fine-grained authorization that Chris gave. So maybe it's a scope plus some sort of GUID or some other identifier that is the record inside your database that stores what Chris specifically granted. So that's another capability to consider. All right, so from this point forward, everything up to that point was about granting the authorization. Now we're going to enforce the authorization. So very typically, you've got API access control here. So you've got your typical components that are looking for the access token, validating that it's still in effect, that it's crypto valid, that Chris hasn't revoked his authorization. That's a very typical component in this case. It's got the right scope, all those sorts of checks. I think the interesting thing to consider here is what does it look like when you're being attacked and in ways that you can't necessarily kind of be one step ahead of the attacker, right? And so, we sell into this space with an AI ML solution for API security, and it's really interesting when you're going into those conversations when customers start asking you, well, can it check this and can I make it check that? The idea of AI ML is actually, it's smarter than you are in a sense, right? You don't configure it with anything. It sort of learns these things over time. It detects correlation. So a lot of the API security breaches are actually valid access tokens. We've already passed that step. Somebody signs up for a temporary account, has a valid access token, they start poking around in the system, and then they eventually figure out some way to exploit it, right? So an AI system is actually looking at the pattern of behavior, seeing maybe the sequencing of what's being called, seeing other resources that the same access token is being used to access and detecting that it looks anomalous, it looks like a hacker, right? And so that's an AI system that's going to block access in the case of detecting an anomaly. So API lifecycle management, here we're talking about your Apogees and MuleSofts, whatever. This is really about publishing APIs, not so much about the security space, although you could probably have it do an access check. But really, it's here in this picture because it's doing rate limiting, it's forming your APIs, it's maybe doing analytics, it's maybe the way that you commercialize your APIs. It's part of the picture, but not necessarily part of the solution we're talking about. And the last thing gets back to that fine-grained authorization. We've got specific records here that Chris has allowed the third party to get on his behalf, has allowed Austin to get on his behalf. And so we need to make sure that, whereas the access token really just says, hey, Austin's able to access the server, in a sense, the finer grain authorization check needs to say, are they able to access the specific X-ray? And I bring this up as a separate capability or component of the infrastructure because we're seeing more and more as there's more regulation, more lines of business with additional requirements, more of these fine-grained consent sorts of use cases, that companies are looking for a central way of managing all those business requirements for who's able to access what data under what circumstance. And so there's a few vendors at the show today, Ping included now, that are offering solutions to centralize that management of who's able to access data. So it does the right checks, looks in that consent record, decides that this Austin's able to access Chris for these specific X-rays, and then now the API calls go to all the microservices behind all the other componentry in front of it. So at this point, I didn't mention earlier, so one of the capabilities of the API access control layer is to potentially do some sort of a token exchange or provide some other authentication to the backends. And my favorite example for that is it's like our badges. Like, so when you go, you want to do a lighter weight authorization to the backends, not the heavyweight authorization of passing the actual access token to the backend. So it's like our badges when we walk into the stalls down upstairs now, or when you go to the sessions. You know, they're just checking that your badge looks official, that you have a QR code. They're not actually asking you to pull out your driver's license, and they're checking that you paid, right? So you want like a lighter weight authorization to the backends, not the heavyweight authorization of the access token at the front end. So now data is going back to the clients. We pulled it from all the different microservices. Now we're going to do potentially an additional check to make sure that Austin's able to access these specific records, again, based on regulation, based on that fine-grained consent. Potentially we're filtering specific attributes or specific records from the data response. API platform goes and munches it all back together to make it look like the right API, and it gets returned. So before Mike comes back up here, I was going to mention two more things to kind of recap. One, 100% based in reality, this is happening today. This is like very much an open banking use case, the way that we've described it. I mean, it's derived from open banking. Open banking is turning into consumer data right in Australia, which is going to be banking, energy, I forget the third one, and Canada's considering open banking right now. So eventually this is going to come to your industry. It might look something just like this. And the second thing is, when I say, like, don't go it alone. Like, your ability to beat your competitors in your space isn't based on whether you have a better password storage scheme or you wrote custom code inside of Apogee to check an access token, right? Focus your resources on the stuff that differentiates you inside of your business or in your space. And there are vendors here, obviously Ping included, that sell into this space that offer all these components for you to just use our capabilities to solve these problems.
Thank you, David. So what David just walked you through gave the surgeon access to the records that he needed to imaginarily repair Chris's arm. So now Chris is fine. Chris has had all of his screws tightened and put back where they're supposed to be. Yay for Chris. Our time is almost up, but I would like to invite all of you to come see David and I at our booth, number 601. Sign up for a free trial, not just Ping Intelligence, but some other products as well. You sign up for free trials. Talk to us if you have any questions. We actually do have a minute left if there are any questions.
You talked about the different pieces in terms of API access authorization. What products plug into those pieces?
Into those pieces?
On the right, yep. On the right, you have the API access controls.
Yeah.
And the API lifecycle management. What Ping products?
Right, so we've got every one of these boxes except for API lifecycle management as a Ping capability. And so multi-factor authentication is Ping ID, authorization server is Ping Federate, directory is Ping Directory, API access control is Ping Access, AI-driven API security is Ping Intelligence for APIs, and then data access governance is Ping Data Governance.
You actually have a variety of options with what you do once an anomaly's been detected. There's no one path that would be forced upon you.
Over here?
From a consent perspective, so once you get the granular codes, right? So is there a UI component where you dynamically generate a consent that is specific to those records?
There is a UI component. The way that Ping Directory does it is we provide APIs right now because, to repeat the question, so it sounds like, are you asking, is there a specific UI component in order to do that fine-grained authorization?
Right, so especially around consents. Right?
Yeah, especially around consents, the fine-grained consent.
The consents are like very
Right. Yeah, so consents are very specific to the use case that we're trying to solve. In the case of open banking, we know what they look like. In the case of, this theoretical healthcare, the consent UI might be something completely different. So what we provide through Ping Directory is an API in which our customers are going to use the API to store the consent inside of Ping Directory. So we don't provide a UI necessarily, mostly because the customers want to make it look like their look and feel. They want to potentially do it on their mobile phone versus their web applications. And so we just give them an API right now. We are talking about building a UI that's a little bit more out of box, but it would need to be customized per each use case. So in the case of open banking, you're seeing, in fact, open banking pretty well specifies like what to show in these cases, but you definitely have to choose which bank accounts.
So in this case, the consent will be more customized to each patient, right? Because each patient wants have their own things to.
Right, yeah. So in terms of what gets stored, kind of the big difference between like a scope authorization or a normal typical OAuth grant versus a fine-grained consent is every time, it's not a yes/no. Every time that it gets granted by every individual, it's very specific to their thing. So it's, what's captured inside of that fine-grained authorization is, in the case of open banking, it's which specific bank accounts and what duration of time for transaction history.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. If you have any other questions, you will be able to find us at the booth on and off throughout the day today and the rest of the week.
Thank you.